Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to take a deep dive into a single article, Sorting the Future, Memory, Education, and the Quiet Return of Authoritarian Logic.
Okay. Yeah, it's a really fascinating piece written by
hmm
Jaime Hoerricks, PhD, an educator and autism advocate. Their background brings a really unique perspective to this piece you'll see as we go through it.
Absolutely, and it tackles a big question. I mean, a huge question. Is education becoming more about sorting and excluding than creating pathways to liberation and equity?
Yeah, Hoerricks makes a really, really strong case for that idea, contrasting education as a relational process,
hmm
one that's rooted in care and justice, with a system that prioritizes, sorting based on perceived usefulness.
When I first read that, it made me think about those aptitude tests we all took growing up. I mean, were we being guided towards our strengths or were we being slotted into predetermined boxes? I mean,
Yeah.
I remember taking those tests and thinking, what does this even mean?
That's exactly the kind of critical thinking that Hoerricks encourages, I think. They actually connect this idea to Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed and the dangers of the banking model of education, where knowledge is just deposited into students
Okay.
rather than co-created.
Okay, so instead of just filling students up with facts, we should be empowering them to question, to think for themselves, to learn collaboratively.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
And to illustrate this, Hoerricks uses a really powerful image that was on the Auschwitz Albums project. And there's this photo of a Nazi officer using a sorting cane to determine the fate of prisoners.
Wow, that's a chilling image.
It is, and it highlights how seemingly simple systems can be
Yeah.
used for decisions with horrific consequences.
Yeah.
Hoerricks uses it to caution us about how easily we can fall into the trap of categorizing and sorting people based on perceived usefulness. Right?
But isn't there always some level of sorting in education? I mean, we have grade levels, specialized programs, even college entrance exams. How do we balance this need for assessment with ensuring fairness and equity?
That's a great question, and it's one Hoerricks grapples with throughout the article. They argue that the problem isn't necessarily assessment itself, okay, but the way it's used to reinforce existing power structures and inequalities.
So it's about who's designing the system, who benefits from it, and whose voices are being silenced.
Exactly. Building on this historical context, Hoerricks turns their attention to modern-day education policy and how it reflects this sorting mentality. They even draw a parallel to Goethe Ali's book, Hitler's Beneficiaries, which argues that many Germans benefited economically from the Nazi regime, turning a blind eye to the atrocities.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Is Hoerricks saying we're seeing a similar dynamic play out in education today where some benefit at the expense of others?
They absolutely are. Hoerricks points to policies like the defunding of public schools and the expansion of charter and religious schools as evidence of a system where some are prioritized over others.
Hold on, though. I mean, some argue that charter schools offer more choice and opportunity, especially for families trapped in failing school districts. How does Hoerricks address that perspective?
They acknowledge the argument for school choice, but caution against the unintended consequences. Hoerricks contends that charter schools often drain resources from public schools, exacerbating existing inequalities. They suggest that instead of creating a separate system, we should focus on strengthening and improving public education for all, right?
So it's about investing in public education as a common good rather than creating a tiered system that further divides us.
Precisely. And this connects to another key aspect of Hoerricks' argument, the ideological battle being waged within education itself. They specifically call out the pushback against Marxist teachers and the suppression of critical theory.
Now, I know there's a lot of misunderstanding around those terms. Can you break it down for our listener?
Yeah, absolutely. When Hoerricks talks about Marxist thought, they're not advocating for communist indoctrination in classrooms. Instead, they're using it as a lens for analyzing power dynamics, inequality, and how institutions, like the education system, can perpetuate or challenge these structures.
So it's about encouraging students to think critically about the world around them, to question why things are the way they are.
Exactly. But as Hoerricks points out, this kind of critical thinking is often seen as a threat to those who benefit from the status quo.
And that's where the connection to fascism comes in. Hoerricks argues that fascism inherently opposes collectivism and equality, seeking to maintain a strict hierarchy.
Yes, and in that framework, education becomes a tool to indoctrinate people into accepting their predetermined place in the social order, stifling dissent and critical thinking.
So the attacks on Marxist teachers and critical theory could be seen as an attempt to control what students learn and how they think, ultimately maintaining existing power structures.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway.
Okay, so we've got this chilling historical parallel with the sorting cane, the connection to modern-day policy decisions, and this ideological battle over the very purpose of education.
It's a lot to unpack, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, where all of this is leading.
Yeah.
What happens if this trend toward sorting and exclusion continues?
It's a question that Hoerricks definitely does not shy away from. In fact, they actually weave in their own personal experiences as a special education teacher to illustrate these larger points.
Right, they talk about the constant struggle of trying to advocate for students within a system that often labels and limits them, especially students from marginalized communities.
Yeah, I can only imagine the emotional toll that takes on a teacher trying to balance the demands of the system with the needs of individual students.
And yeah, it's especially impactful because Horrocks is also neurodivergent,
Yeah.
right? They have firsthand experience with being labeled and sorted by a system that doesn't always value difference.
Hmm. That personal perspective adds so much weight to their arguments.
It does. Horrocks even wrote a book about their experience navigating the education system as an autistic person called No Place for Autism.
Wow, that title alone speaks volumes. It makes you think about how many other students are being told they don't belong, they don't fit the mold.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this broader trend toward standardization and efficiency in education. Horrocks is concerned that we're losing sight of the individual, of the unique potential that each student brings to the table.
So instead of nurturing that potential, we're trying to fit everyone into the same box, measure them against the same narrow set of standards.
It's like we're more concerned with producing compliant workers than nurturing creative thinkers and problem solvers.
Hoerricks even compares it to training students for survival rather than for development, for simply getting by instead of thriving.
Right, and that raises some serious questions about the kind of society we're creating. What happens to innovation, to critical thinking, to our ability to solve complex problems if we continue down this path?
It's a pretty bleak picture, but does Hoerricks offer any solutions, any hope for a different future?
They do, and it starts with awareness. Hurricks believes that by recognizing these patterns of exclusion and control, we can begin to challenge them.
So it's about more than just voting for the right candidates or donating to education reform initiatives.
It's about actively engaging in the fight for educational justice in our own communities. It's about supporting teachers who are pushing for a more inclusive and equitable curriculum. It's about advocating for policies that fund schools fairly and meet the needs of all students.
And it's about challenging the dominant narrative that sees education as a tool for sorting and ranking rather than a path to liberation and personal growth.
Absolutely. Horrocks challenges us to imagine a different kind of education, one that values diversity, celebrates individual strengths, and empowers students to become critical thinkers and agents of change.
But how do we get there? How do we shift the focus from standardization and competition to collaboration and individual growth?
Well, Horrocks doesn't offer a simple answer, but they do provide some concrete steps we can take.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, they talk about the importance of supporting public education as a common good, ensuring that all students have access to quality resources, regardless of their zip code or socioeconomic status.
That makes sense. Instead of creating separate systems for those who can afford to opt out, we need to strengthen the foundation of public education for everyone.
Exactly. And they also highlight the importance of questioning the metrics we use to measure success in education. Are standardized tests truly an accurate measure of a student's potential, or are they simply reinforcing existing inequalities?
I've always been skeptical of those tests. They never felt like they captured the full picture of a student's abilities or potential.
That's a really valid point. Hurricks suggests we need to look beyond these narrow measures and start valuing different types of intelligence, different ways of learning and expressing knowledge.
So it's about recognizing and celebrating the diversity of human potential, not trying to fit everyone into the same mold.
Precisely. And that connects to another key point Horrocks makes, the need to embrace neurodiversity in education.
I love that they highlight this. We need to move away from seeing differences as deficits and start appreciating the unique contributions that neurodivergent students bring to the classroom.
Absolutely. It's about creating a learning environment that welcomes and supports all students, recognizing that there's no one right way to learn or think.
Yeah, this resonates with me so much. I remember feeling like a square peg trying to fit into a round hole in school. It took me years to realize that my unconventional thinking wasn't a weakness, it was actually a strength.
That's a really powerful insight, and it speaks to the need for greater understanding and acceptance of different learning styles and abilities.
So how do we translate this into practical action? How do we create schools that truly value and support neurodiversity?
Well, Hoerricks suggests that it starts with challenging the traditional deficit-based model of special education.
So instead of focusing on what students can't do, we should be identifying and nurturing their strengths and talents.
Exactly. It's about providing individualized support that meets the specific needs of each student, recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to learning.
And it's about creating a culture of inclusion where all students feel valued and respected, regardless of their differences.
Precisely. It's about moving away from labels and limitations and embracing the full spectrum of human potential.
Hoerricks even talks about the dangers of gatekeeping in education, where certain students are excluded or denied opportunities based on their perceived abilities or disabilities.
That's a crucial point. They argue that these gatekeeping mechanisms often serve to maintain existing power structures and limit access to resources and opportunities for marginalized students.
So it's not just about providing accommodations or support services, it's about dismantling the systemic barriers that prevent students from fully participating in the educational process.
Exactly. It's about creating a truly equitable system where all students have the opportunity to learn, grow, and reach their full potential.
This is all so important, and it really makes you think about the responsibility we all have to advocate for a more just and equitable education system.
It does. Hoerricks reminds us that education is not just about acquiring knowledge or skills. It's about shaping the kind of society we want to live in.
So the choices we make about education today will have a profound impact on the future of our communities and our world.
Absolutely. It's about more than just individual success or achievement. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive and contribute their unique talents.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that education can be a powerful tool for social change, for creating a more just and equitable world.
And that brings us right back to the heart of Hoerricks' argument, this idea of a quiet return to authoritarian logic in education.
Right, this notion that we're subtly shifting towards a system that prioritizes control and compliance over critical thinking and individual expression.
Exactly. And Hoerricks argues that this shift isn't just happening in education. It's a reflection of broader societal trends.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, they point to the rise of surveillance technologies, the erosion of privacy, the increasing concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few.
So it's like we're sleepwalking into a future where individual freedom and autonomy are slowly being chipped away.
That's the fear. And Hoerricks suggests that education is playing a key role in this process by conditioning students to accept a world where they are constantly monitored, evaluated, and sorted.
That's a chilling thought. It makes you wonder what we can do to resist these trends, to reclaim the transformative power of education.
Well, Hoerricks ends the article with a call to action, urging us to recognize these patterns and actively resist them.
So it's not enough to just be aware of the problem, we need to do something about it.
Exactly. Hoerricks challenges us to become more engaged in our communities, to advocate for policies that support equitable and inclusive education, to challenge the dominant narratives that perpetuate these harmful systems.
It's about reclaiming the power of education as a force for liberation, for individual growth, for social justice.
And it starts with each of us asking critical questions, challenging the status quo, demanding better for ourselves and our communities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listener to take away from Hoerricks' work?
I think it's the importance of recognizing that education is never neutral. It's always a battleground for competing values and ideologies.
And the choices we make about education today will have a profound impact on the kind of world we create tomorrow.
Absolutely. It's about more than just test scores or college admissions. It's about shaping the future of our society.
So let's all be mindful of the choices we make, the policies we support, the narratives we embrace.
Let's work together to ensure that education becomes a tool for building a more just, equitable, and liberating world for all.
Well said. And to our listener, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas, to engage in those critical conversations about the purpose and direction of education in your own communities. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Jaime Hoerricks' insightful and challenging work. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future.